The Taming of Elphaba. How the Wicked Witch Became Relatable. Introduction. Once upon a time, there was a wicked witch. No backstory, no redemption arc, just a terrifying woman in black ruling over an army of flying monkeys and waiting to kill a little girl from Kansas. But over the past century, something changed. The Wicked Witch of the West got a name, she got a childhood, she got a love story, a cause, and eventually, she became the hero. But in making her more relatable, did we lose something? Did we take away the very thing that made her so compelling in the first place? Today we're going to trace Elphaba's transformation. How she went from a pure villain to a tragic rebel to a misunderstood hero, and ask, have we tamed her too much? Part 1. The original Wicked Witch, a symbol of pure evil. Let's go back to the beginning. In L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West wasn't much of a character at all. She was a stock villain, there to create tension, to frighten readers, and to be defeated. She had no real personality, no backstory, not even a name. Her biggest defining traits? One eye, a love of enslaving creatures, and a major water allergy. But the 1939 movie adaptation made her into something unforgettable. Margaret Hamilton's version of the Wicked Witch wasn't just bad, she was iconic. The green skin, the sharp cackle, the absolute menace in her voice. She was theatrical, larger than life, and completely, unapologetically evil. And for decades, that was more than enough. This was the golden age of fairy tales and Hollywood storytelling, where villains were just villains. But something changed. We stopped being satisfied with simple good versus evil stories. We wanted why, we wanted depth, and in the 1990s, one book finally gave us that. Part 2. Wicked the Novel, a complex political rebel. Gregory Maguire's Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, flipped the entire story of Oz on its head. What if the Wicked Witch wasn't wicked? What if she was a victim? What if Oz itself was corrupt and she was the only one willing to fight back? This Elphaba wasn't a monster. She was an outcast. She was born with green skin and rejected by her own family. She was intelligent, passionate, and painfully aware of the injustice around her. And unlike Dorothy's Oz, a bright, whimsical place, Wicked's Oz was dark, political, oppressive. The novel explored deep themes: prejudice, classism, propaganda, the way history is rewritten by those in power. Elphaba wasn't wicked. She was perceived that way because she refused to conform. But while this version of her was fascinating, it was also, well, heavy. The book is dark, philosophical, and honestly kind of depressing. So when Broadway adapted Wicked in 2003, they had to change things up. Part 3. Wicked the Musical, a heroic outsider. The Broadway musical took Wicked's basic premise, but reworked it into something more accessible, more uplifting, and a lot more marketable. The biggest change? Friendship. Instead of a lonely, politically driven outcast, Elphaba became the other half of one of musical theater's greatest duos, Elphaba and Glinda. The story focused less on the politics of Oz and more on the personal. Elphaba's struggle to accept herself, her bond with Glinda, and her decision to defy expectations. The song that cemented her as a hero, Defying Gravity, isn't about revolution or fighting a system like in a book. It's about personal empowerment. It's about realizing that you don't have to fit in, that you can be different and still be powerful. And that's why the musical's Elphaba resonated with so many people. But if the musical softened her, Wicked the movie might have taken it even further. Part 4. Wicked the Movie, The Final Taming? In 2024, Wicked Part 1 brought Elphaba's story to the big screen, and while it stays close to the musical, it leans even harder into making her human. This Elphaba is almost entirely sympathetic. The movie emphasizes her loneliness, her kindness, her pain. Gone are the sharper, more ambiguous edges of the book's version of her. Now she's a clear-cut hero. She's not wicked, she's just misunderstood. So, did we take away too much? Did we tame her beyond recognition? Part 5, a sidetrack. The changing meaning of wicked. There is something interesting about all of this. The word wicked itself has changed meaning over time. In Baum's day, wickedness was simple. It meant evil, cruel, dangerous. If you were wicked, you were a villain. End of story. But in the late 20th century, wicked has started to shift. Slang in the 1980s and 90s, especially in the UK and parts of the US, used wicked to mean cool, powerful, even awesome. A skateboarder might say a trick was wicked. A rebellious character in a movie could be described as having a wicked attitude. Wicked didn't just mean bad anymore, it meant impressive. And that change is exactly what happened to Elphaba. She started as pure evil, then became complex, then became powerful. By the time the musical Wicked came along, the title wasn't meant to say she was bad, it was meant to say she was misunderstood, maybe even amazing. Wicked became a word of empowerment. So in a way, the changing meaning of the word reflects the changing way we see Elphaba. Once upon a time, wickedness meant she had to be defeated. Now, it means she has to rise. Part 6. So, what really happened? So why did this taming happen? Why did Elphaba go from terrifying villain to a misunderstood rebel to a full-fledged hero? To answer that, we need to look at it from both a psychological and sociological perspective. Psychologically, people are drawn to narratives that help them make sense of the world, and the shift in how we portray villains reflects a growing cultural interest in nuance. We no longer see the world in the stark black and white morality of fairy tales. Instead, modern audiences are more aware of the role of environment, trauma, and systemic oppression in shaping individuals. We understand that people aren't born wicked. They're shaped by circumstances, by how society treats them, by the choices they're forced to make. This is why stories today focus so much on why villains become villains, because we now recognize that evil isn't just a character trait, it's something created. And that shift in thinking makes redemption arcs, or at least deeper explorations of villainy, feel more truthful to modern audiences. Sociologically, this trend is tied to how we think about power and oppression. In the past, stories reinforced clear moral structures. Heroes were good, villains were bad, and order had to be restored. But as society has changed, so has our understanding of authority and rebellion. In today's world, we're more skeptical of dominant power structures. We question historical narratives, challenge systemic oppression, and celebrate those who defy unjust systems. And that means characters like Elphaba, Maleficent, and even the Joker aren't just seen as villains anymore. They're seen as products of a corrupt world. They go from being antagonists to symbols, stand-ins for the marginalized, the misunderstood, the ones who refuse to play by the rules of an unfair system. The villains of the past have become the anti-heroes of today because culturally, we have shifted to sympathizing with those who challenge authority rather than those who uphold it. This shift isn't just happening in fantasy stories, it's everywhere. Breaking Bad made us root for Walter White, a man who became the villain of his own story. Game of Thrones blurred the lines between hero and villain so much that it became impossible to tell the difference. Even children's movies are following this pattern. Disney rebranded Maleficent and Cruella as misunderstood women fighting against the world that wronged them. So when we look at Elphaba's transformation, it's not just about making her likable. It's about reflecting a larger cultural desire to understand rather than condemn. We don't want wicked witches anymore. We want complex, wounded figures who are given the chance to tell their side of the story. But the question remains, in our quest to humanize villains, are we losing something? Do we still need characters who are unapologetically, irredeemably wicked? Also, there is another interesting side to the taming process. While Elphaba has gained more sympathy over time, she hasn't necessarily become more complex. If anything, the most layered and morally ambiguous version of her was still the one in Wicked, the life and times of the Wicked Witch of the West. Gregory Maguire's Elphaba wasn't just a misunderstood outcast, she was deeply flawed, often difficult person, caught in a world where no easy moral answers existed. She was a political radical, a believer in change, but also someone who struggled with her own limitations. She made mistakes, hurt people, and yet, at her core, she was driven by a desperate need to make sense of a cruel and unfair world. But when Wicked became a musical, much of that nuance was stripped away. The Broadway version of Elphaba is still an outcast, still passionate, still fighting against oppression, but the complexity of her political beliefs is mostly erased. Instead, she becomes a more traditional hero, brave, misunderstood, and ultimately right in her fight against the system. The ambiguity is gone. Elphaba is framed as good, and the wizards and Madame Morrible as bad. However, there is an even bigger shift in how her story ends. In Baum's original book, Dorothy kills the witch and then, interestingly, manages to break the system in Oz. She overthrows the wizard's rule and the oppressive structures collapse, making way for something new. But in the musical Wicked, Elphaba doesn't overthrow anything. She doesn't break the establishment. Instead, she escapes it. She fakes her own death and disappears, leaving the world of Oz behind. It's a quieter, more personal ending, one that suggests that sometimes fighting the system isn't as important as fighting freedom from it. And now, with Wicked Part 1, we're seeing another shift. So far, the movie adaptation has stayed close to the musical, meaning that Elphaba's arc is still more about personal empowerment than about systemic change. But with Part 2 on the horizon, the question remains, what kind of ending will this version of Elphaba get? Will she stay true to the musical and walk away from Oz? Or will the film take a different route and finally allow her to reshape the world she fought against? If Wicked Part 2 chooses to deepen her story, it has the potential to restore some of the nuance lost in previous adaptations. But if it simply follows the musical structure, we may end up with an Elphaba who, while inspiring, is still much less morally complex than the one we first met in Maguire's novel. The Wicked Witch of the West started as a terrifying force of nature, then became a tragic antihero. But what comes next? That's the real question. Conclusion. Where does Elphaba go from here? So what does all of this mean? Over the last century, Elphaba has gone through a fascinating transformation, from a pure villain to a deeply complex revolutionary to a more conventional hero, and with each adaptation she has gained sympathy but lost some of her ambiguity. Gregory Maguire's Wicked gave us an Elphaba who was raw, deeply flawed, and politically engaged, someone who tried to change the system but ultimately couldn't escape its consequences. The musical softens her, making her more of a misunderstood but righteous figure, while also shifting her story away from revolution and toward personal escape. And now, with the Wicked movies, we're seeing an even further refinement of her character, shaping her into a clear-cut, inspiring hero. But as we wait for Wicked Part 2, one question remains. Will this version of Elphaba reclaim some of the depth and ambiguity that was lost along the way? Will she challenge the system in a meaningful way, or will she once again choose to walk away from it? So I leave the question to you. Do you prefer the complex, morally ambiguous Elphaba of the novel, or do you love the inspiring hero she has become? And what do you think Wicked Part 2 will do to the story? Will it stay true to the musical, or take it in a new direction? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more explorations of the stories and characters we love. Thanks for watching!